Hello everybody and welcome to today's webinar. Today I'm joined by Dorothy Graham and we're delighted Dorothy has joined us to present a webinar on Are Your Tests Well Travelled? Thoughts about coverage. Dorothy has been at every EuroSTAR and she's the only one who can say that, so we're delighted that she can come along and present a webinar with us. She's also part of the programme committee for our upcoming EuroSTAR conference, which is taking place next month from the 27th to the 28th of February in London. If you have any questions for Dorothy, you can type them into your questions field there on the control panel, and at the end of the webinar we will go through your questions one by one. So now we're going to hand you over to Dorothy. So, hello Dorothy.
Hello, Darrell. I need to click on that one, I think.
Perfect.
Okay. Good. Well, welcome everyone. I'm talking about coverage today. Are your tests well traveled? Some thoughts about coverage and also about strawberry jam, but I'll come to that a bit later. So what I'm planning to talk about are, first of all, there's going to be an analogy with traveling. What coverage is? Should testing be thorough? What coverage is not and is often mistaken for? And the 4 caveats of coverage, some traps that you might fall into, and an important question that you should ask about coverage. So first of all, where on earth have you been? Well, let me just rephrase that slightly. Where on earth have you been? I don't know whether you've seen a lot of the world. Have you done a lot of traveling? Do you consider yourself well-traveled? I've done a fair amount of traveling myself, so I suppose I would consider myself well-traveled. So if you asked me, are you well-traveled? I might say yes. But what does that mean? Or what if I were to say 85% or 100% or 18.4%? What does that mean? I don't know if you've seen these maps, but they are, my daughter gave me one, and it's got a sort of a gold foil printed on top of a map of the world. And what you basically do is to scratch off places that you've been. So I thought, oh, that's fun, but what am I supposed to scratch off? Is it cities, whole countries, states? So I thought, well, I'll start with cities. So first thing I did was I scratched off the cities. Can you see them on here? Actually, it doesn't show up very well when you're looking at the whole map, does it? But I have actually scratched off 74 cities, and I've also realized I missed a couple that I've been to that I forgot to scratch off. So perhaps if we look a bit more closely at Australia, you can see the 4 cities that I've scratched off, not very tidily, because I have actually been to Melbourne, Canberra, Sydney, and Brisbane. So I've seen some of Australia, but I certainly haven't seen all of it. There's a number of cities and an awful lot of Australia that still remains unseen by me. Now, on the States, which is where I'm originally from, I've been to a lot more cities. And looking at this map, one of the things that struck me was Michigan, which was where I was born. It's showing only Detroit and Lansing. In fact, it's put Lansing in quite the wrong place, about 200 miles south of where it should be. And even worse, it's not showing what for me is the most important city, which is Grand Rapids, which is where I was born. So perhaps the map itself has a problem or two. But, I mean, seeing just the cities isn't terribly impressive. Perhaps I should look at states and scratch off the states. And if I do that with Australia, it looks like I've seen about half the country. That's certainly much more impressive. Well, I haven't actually seen any more of the country, but it looks a lot better. And with the states and Canada, I've seen more than half of the provinces and all but 5 of the states in the US. There's only 4 in the deep south that I haven't been to, plus Hawaii. So certainly going to that level of coverage, because that's what it is, looks a lot more impressive. Well, maybe we should go with whole hog and do country coverage. That looks even more impressive, I think. Because you can see I've claimed all of Canada, all of the states, all of Brazil, although I've only been to 2 cities there, all of Australia, all of China. So I've certainly claimed a lot of coverage for the world, even though I haven't actually seen any more than when I had just scratched off the cities. But it looks better, doesn't it? It looks far more impressive. That's because this is a shallower level of coverage, if you like. Only one visit to one city in the whole of that country, and I can claim I've seen that country, which in a sense is true. So here's some travel metrics. Where you live, have you been to every street in the place where you live? Have you been to every city or town in the county or area where you live? Have you been to every state or province if you have them? Have you been to every country in the world? I haven't. Have you been to every continent? I've been to 6 out of 7, never been to Antarctica. Now, one of the interesting things in looking at that map, especially when I've scratched off all the countries, is seeing where I haven't been. And there are certainly a great number of areas where I haven't been yet, and that's also interesting in testing. So what's this got to do with coverage? Well, it's actually quite a good analogy with coverage, because if we look at test coverage, rather than have you seen a lot of the world, it's have your tests seen a lot of the system. Are the tests well-traveled? In other words, do you have good coverage? Well, what does it mean if you say yes? I put it to you, that's not a lot. What does it mean if you say 85% or 100%? Well, it probably means a bit more than just saying yes. And in fact, it does have a very specific meaning. So it does mean something, but not just when you say, do you have good coverage? Because just the word coverage on its own isn't enough to say what you actually have achieved. So let's look at some coverage metrics. Have your tests been to every statement or every decision or every branch in the code? Have your tests exercised every data combination? Have your tests seen every error message and every menu option, every program or function, every user story option? And what's also interesting is where in the code haven't your tests been? That's also interesting to know about. So what is coverage anyway? Well, we have our system here and we have some tests. And when we run the tests through the system, we find that the tests have exercised or has covered some part of the system. The area that's in that circle has been tested, has been covered by those tests. And the other areas outside that inner circle have not been covered by these tests. So here we have some more tests, and when these run through the system, we actually have more coverage than the previous set of tests. So this level of coverage is higher, if you like. Okay, well here we have even more tests, and look at this. When we go and run these tests through the system, yay, we've got 100% coverage. That means that's absolutely great. That means we've tested all of the system, right? Or have we? Well, of course, we haven't. But hang on a minute, you say. Look, we've covered everything. We've tested everything. Well, the problem is, yes, we have tested all of something, but there are a lot more things than just the thing that we've seen tested here. There are many more levels of coverage. Just as with a map, we had coverage of cities, of states, of countries, or even of continents. Within testing, there is coverage of lots of different things. Modules, statement branches, states, or data, or menu options, or functions, business rules, user stories. There are many different levels of coverage that you can have. And by achieving 100% of one of them does not generally mean you've achieved 100% of any of the others. And some are a lot stronger than others. I want to illustrate that with a little code fragment now, the difference between statement and decision coverage. So we have a program here which is supposed to double any number that's greater than 6. So we have some statement numbers there, and we have our first test case, which is inputting the number 7. So our first line, we read into the variable a the value of 7. So that's our first statement there. Then we go on to our second statement, which is an if statement or a decision statement. And here we have to make a test. Is 7 greater than 6? Yes. So the exit from this decision is the true branch, and we go down and we exercise statement number 3. And then after that, we go down and exercise the end if. I know you can argue whether that's a statement or not, but bear with me. And then we go on to print B. So at this point, we have our test case A has gone through boxes 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and we have 100% statement coverage. Great. So it's 100% tested, right? Well, even though we do have 100% coverage of statements for this little program, we could look at another level of coverage, a deeper level of coverage, and that would be decision coverage. Because we, in terms of the decision, and you see our box here has two exits, the true exit, and there's a false exit. But our tests so far have only taken the true exit. So although we have 100% statement coverage, we've only covered 50%, 1 out of 2, of the decisions. So if we want a stronger level of coverage, then we have to have at least one more test case. So here's our second test case, and this we're going to input a value of 3. So again, we read A, and that's that statement, and now we go down to our decision. And in this case, 3 is not greater than 6, so it's less than 6. So we don't do statement 3. So we take the false exit from the decision and go straight down to statement 4, and then down to statement 5. So our second test case on its own has gone through statements 1, 2, 4, and 5. So we only have 80% coverage of the statements with test B. And we have 50% decision coverage, but we have the other 50%, if you like. So taking these two tests together means we have achieved both statement and decision coverage. And in fact, if you achieve 100% decision coverage, that guarantees that you've also covered all of your statements. Now, you may have noticed that there's something a little bit strange here, and if so, good for you, but we're going to come back to that a bit later. But this is what coverage is. The ISTQB definitions of coverage, the degree expressed as a percentage to which a specified coverage item has been exercised by a test suite. And, well, what's a coverage item? A coverage item is an entity or property used as the basis for test coverage. For example, equivalence partitions or code statements or menu options or user stories or anything that you can count, basically, and make a list of and can tell whether a test has gone through it, that can be a coverage item. And coverage is the measure of how many of those items that you have listed have been exercised by a test. So it's sort of implied in the ISTQB definitions, but I think it's an important thing to be aware of, is that coverage is actually a relationship. It's a relationship between a set of tests and some countable part of the system, something that we can count. So 100% coverage is not 100% tested. It's only 100% of some countable things among several other types of countable things. So if you want to call it 100% tested, well, you better qualify what you mean by tested, because it's not testing absolutely everything. It's testing all, if you have 100%, it's testing all of a list of some things. So basically what coverage is an objective measurement, and that's good because objective measurements are fairly factual, of some aspect of thoroughness. Because if you've tested all of your statements, you have been thorough in the testing of statements. And thoroughness is an attribute of testing which might be a good thing. Or is it? If thoroughness is what you want, then coverage is the measure to use. But I want to talk a bit about thoroughness. So if you're wanting coverage, you're saying in some sense you want thoroughness in some respect. Now, is that the best way to do testing? Should testing be thorough? And if so, why should testing be thorough? Well, here's where the strawberry jam comes in. Should testing be like butter or like strawberry jam? And there are differences in the way, I don't know if you're like this, but to me these look a bit different. So if testing is like butter, then we spread it evenly over the bread. We have the same thickness throughout, and no part is not covered. And if we're talking about software, every part of the software is tested to the same thickness, to the same degree, to the same extent. But if we say, well, maybe testing is more like strawberry jam, it's thicker in some places than others. And there are big lumps in it that you can't flatten out because they're actually pieces of real strawberry. And some parts may end up not being covered because with the same amount of jam, because we had lumps, we might not get everything over all of the bread. Now, what about the software? Should some parts of the software be tested more than other parts of the software? Or should they all be tested to the same level? That's what thoroughness is about. And it's the difference between the breadth of testing and the depth of testing. And there's a bit of an illusion here. Now here we have our system, and we have some major bugs and minor bugs in it. We can't see any yet, but that's because we haven't done any testing. So the first approach we're going to take is to do the breadth or the width. And that's basically coverage. So we want a shallow look across the whole of the system and see what bugs we find. Oh good, we found some bugs. A couple of minor ones and a major one. Well, that's good. This testing has been worthwhile, right? Well, that's a breadth approach or a coverage approach. But what about a depth approach or a lumpy testing or selective testing? Well, in this case, we might do some testing across the top, but we're also going to delve in deep and do more thorough testing in the areas that we have assessed as being the most risky. So the bugs that are in the riskiest areas are going to be more severe than the bugs that are in less risky areas. So now we find that with our depth testing, our selective testing, we have found some interesting things. We've found two of the bugs we found with the coverage, but we found a lot more and a lot more serious bugs. So what's better testing? Well, actually, there isn't a straight answer to that question. The answer is it depends. But it's certainly worth thinking about whether testing should always be thorough or not. Is it better to be, in a sense, more thorough in looking at the most serious bugs rather than trying to be thorough in terms of trying to cover the width of everything that you can list? Because the problem is, if you have this width approach with coverage, the tendency is to say, right, I've covered everything, I've tested everything, haven't missed a thing. And that's an illusion, and that's a trap. Because, yes, you have missed things because you haven't gone deep. But even with the depth, you have also missed things, and that's interesting. So what is the goal for testing? If you're aiming for the width or the coverage approach, then every part will be tested once. This, of course, levels of coverage might be required by regulatory bodies, and sometimes that's necessary to do that, so that's useful to know. It's a wide view, and no area is untouched. Now, it's difficult to argue that doing testing where you don't test something is thorough, because it isn't. So if you haven't achieved a level of coverage of some kind, then there are things that you haven't tested. And that might not be a good idea, especially if you did it by accident. And of course, you may miss something because you haven't gone deep. Now, if you take the other approach, the lumpy approach, then not all parts of the system are equally important or equally risky. That's the philosophy. Now, is that true for your system? I suspect it probably is. So we're focusing on where the testing will bring the greatest value. We'll find the most severe bugs, for example. And it's a deep view concentrating on the critical parts. But because we're concentrating on those parts, we are not looking at some other parts, so we may miss something. Notice anything similar to the other column? We may miss something no matter what we do. But what's important, now I'm not saying one way is better than the other way. In fact, the best way is probably a sum of each. But it's worth thinking if you're being driven to get coverage, it's certainly worth thinking about whether coverage is the most important thing or whether thoroughness might be something which is is not one-dimensional. You don't want to just think of thoroughness in terms of the width, but in terms of addressing other things as well, like critical risky areas. Now here's another thing which is sometimes taken to be coverage and often talked about as coverage, but it is not. Here are the tests we have, and here is the system. And as the tests go through the system, there they go, we now say, oh, we've done all the tests. We've done 100% of the tests. Now, hang on a minute. We've run all the tests that we've thought of. This means we've done the testing that we did. This is not coverage. There's a name for this. It's called test completion. And knowing what percentage of tests you have run out of the ones that you had available or the ones that you intended to run can be useful. But this is not coverage. Coverage is not a relationship between the tests and the tests, which is what this is. Coverage is a relationship between the tests and the system. How much of the system have you tested, not how many tests have you done. So I'll get off my high horse in a minute, but this is not coverage. I see people calling this coverage, and it is not coverage. Actually, I see people using the word coverage very loosely without really thinking what it actually means. So I have some warnings for you, some caveats. The 4 caveats of coverage and a couple of traps that you shouldn't fall into. So the first caveat is that any single coverage measure is only a measure of one level of coverage out of many of them. We had our different coverage levels. We are able to see that perhaps we have one coverage of one level and maybe not of another, but what is the right level of coverage? If you really want to have coverage, for example, looking at the map, what's the right level of coverage for that? City, state, or country? In the end, I went for countries. I think that's the way it was meant to be done, but it's a little bit misleading at times. So if you say you have coverage of all the functions of your system, maybe you only have one test for each function. Is that thorough enough? Well, in terms of function coverage, yes, it is. But it's a bit misleading if a function is very complex and it should have been tested a lot more thoroughly. Statements, menu options, user stories, and also what level of coverage. Are you always going to look for 100% coverage? Sometimes it's not even possible to achieve 100% coverage. There are infeasible combinations of things that mean you cannot possibly have both this be true and this be true at the same time, and the coverage actually is not possible to be achieved, especially the more complicated levels of coverage, the deeper levels. Well, is 80% okay? Well, I don't know. Maybe what we could do, and this can be, in fact, very useful, is to measure the coverage that you have just to see what it is. And then you are able to see then what you have missed. And that can be very interesting in terms of the system. By the way, if you've never measured coverage before and you would like to start doing that and see what coverage you have, I'd recommend that you sort of open a book on it. So you say, let's see, how much coverage do you think we have with this set of tests? And you give a prize to the person who gets nearest to the correct number, maybe a bar of chocolate or something like that. But you might be surprised. You might be expecting that you've covered like 90% of the system and find that you've only covered 30%, for example. That can be very interesting. But remember, still, a single measure is only one level of coverage. Maybe you have 30% of decision coverage and 50% of the statements. The second one is that you only need one test to cover it. To cover Australia or Brazil, I only needed to visit one city per country. So I claimed some big areas there, even though I've only been to, well, 2 cities in Brazil and 4 in Australia. So to cover a coverage element, a statement, decision, outcome, menu, option, or function, you only need one test per element. So you only needed one test to get statement coverage in our code example. You needed 2 tests to get decision coverage, but that was because there were 2 decision outcomes. So there were 2 coverage elements there, 2 coverage items. And the other thing is that, I mean, perhaps you have a decision in the software about whether to approve a loan application from a bank, for example. Now, there are only two decisions outcomes there. Yes, we approve the loan, or no, we don't. So you only need two tests. But if you're approving loan applications, I would think just two tests would be rather limiting in terms of seeing whether this software is working correctly. There may well be hundreds of factors that go into whether a loan application should be approved or not. And there might be hundreds of ways that the users will actually go through a particular decision and take either the true or the false exit. But you only need one for coverage. So going back to our little code fragment, when we had our second test, you'll notice we had, it's not supposed to double the number, so we put an expected output of 3. But if you look at the code, it's read the value of 3. This is false, so it goes here, and now it's printing B. Well, hang on a minute, what's it going to print? Well, what value does B have? Well, we don't know, do we? It's actually undefined. And nowhere in this code fragment have we set a value for B. So when this test runs, it will probably print 0, or it might print just any old rubbish that happens to be in whatever B is pointing to. It's pretty unlikely to print 3. So we have a bug, in fact, because we haven't set a value to B before we print it. But that doesn't matter, because we still got coverage. Well, it does matter, but it's not related to coverage. And coverage is not related to the quality of the software or the quality of the test, for that matter. We still have decision coverage here, even though the test fails, even though we have a bug. We still have the coverage. By the way, statement coverage only wouldn't have found that bug. Let me tell you a story. This was from quite a while ago, but it was a client where they had some software that was being supplied to them from a third party. And they weren't very happy with the quality of the software from this third party, so they decided that the best way to get better quality software was to require decision coverage. I think they went for 80%. I don't actually remember the details. So in order to keep supplying software to this company, the supplier went ahead and bought a tool, coverage measurement tool, and when they sent in the next release, the next version of whatever it was they were developing for them, they also got the printout from the tool showing that they had achieved the required coverage. Now you might think the company receiving the software would be delighted, but in actual fact they weren't, because the software was still rubbish. The tests, although they exercised, they didn't pass. There were still lots of bugs, but they did get the coverage that they required. So the client then realized that, I guess we should, in addition to having coverage, we should have also said the tests should pass, the software should work, and we should have good tests. So although coverage can be useful, this is another trap. Be aware of that. And then the fourth one is that what we're measuring with coverage is what exists, not what should exist. So if this is the system as it's been built, and this is the system as it's needed, the coverage is looking at only what is there. It's a white box technique. So if you're looking at code coverage, menu option coverage, all that kind of thing, it's looking at what's there. Now there may be some functions that are missing. They were needed, but they were never built. And coverage is never going to find that, even with 100% coverage. Some of you might be thinking, what about requirements coverage? I'll come to that in a moment. So, for example, some of the map didn't show some cities that I have visited. For Alaska, for example, the only city shown before I scratched it off was Juneau. After I scratched it off, there was Anchorage, but Fairbanks still wasn't there. And the thing I was most upset, of course, is that Grand Rapids wasn't there on the map of Michigan. So the ones that weren't showed, were they important to me? It wasn't on the map. So what about coverage? It doesn't show missing functions or features. Are the missing functions and features important? Well, I suspect that most of the time, if you have something missing, it is very important. And what about requirements coverage? Surely then we're going to cover everything that's important. Well, requirements coverage is good. It's a good idea. But of course, we're still only covering the list of requirements that we originally made. If we haven't put one of the important requirements into the list of requirements to check the coverage of, then we're still going to miss it. So it's still actually covering only what's there, only what does exist, rather than what should exist. But you're probably more likely to get better results if you're trying to measure the coverage of your requirements. But of course, that's less easy to do. With code coverage, there are lots of different tools out there, and they're fairly well established. There are some requirements tools there. I was looking on Paul Gerard's tool knowledge base, and there are probably about a dozen requirements coverage tools listed. I don't know anything about them, but it's more difficult to do that because it's more difficult to decide what the requirements are and whether you've tested them. So it's still a good idea. So we have some coverage traps. We have our 4 coverage caveats. It's only one level, only one aspect of thoroughness. We only need one test to tick the box. It's not related to how good the tests or the software are. It tests only what's there, not what's missing. And 100% coverage is not 100% tested. Now, the problem is with coverage, and this is a key point, that the word coverage feels sort of comfy and reassuring. And I think that's probably because of insurance. You know, are you insured? Is your car insured? Is your house insured? Is your life insured? Ah, I'm covered. I can breathe a sigh of relief. I don't have to worry about something. And is the software covered? Do you have coverage? Well, that feels like it should be really nice. And the trouble is, you think, ah, I'm covered. I haven't missed anything. I don't have to worry about anything. But of course, hopefully, as we've just seen with these caveats, just because you have coverage in one dimension does not mean that your system is thoroughly tested, is 100% tested. And there are a number of aspects of coverage which are important to understand if you want to have a meaningful discussion about coverage. So I'll finish with the question, the very important question that you should ask when you have a discussion about coverage. Now, there are a lot of people who talk about coverage, and you've probably often seen things like, we need to increase our coverage, or what coverage are we getting? That's probably an easier one to answer. Make sure you cover 100%. If we automate, we'll get better coverage. Yeah, that's a popular one. We need as much coverage as possible. Well, that's a very interesting one. I don't think that means anything at all. So the next time you hear we need coverage or words to that effect, the question you should ask is, of what? Coverage of what? Exactly what countable things need to be covered by tests, need to be exercised by tests? Why is it important to test them? Well, if people are asking for 100% coverage, why is it important to test them all? And what should we not test if we're going to test all of them? Would it be better if we tested more deeply with lumpy testing? It would, if we were looking at the more risky areas, so our testing was selective rather than just broad brush across thinly, strawberry jam rather than butter approach. And what can we safely not test? Because no matter what you do, you will miss something. We always miss something when we're testing. We can never test everything. So it's better, I think, to make a conscious decision about what to miss rather than to fool yourself into thinking that you haven't missed anything. And if you just go for coverage and say, coverage is all, coverage is what we need, we must have coverage, then you may well be fooling yourself into thinking that you haven't missed anything when you have. If you take a lumpy testing approach, then you are consciously focusing on certain areas and you know you're missing something. And I think that's a better position to be in. But even if you do coverage, be aware that you will also be missing things. So I hope there are some questions coming up at the end of the webinar. We've looked at what coverage is. It's a relationship between tests and what is tested. And coverage is not test completion. My tests tested what I tested. What percentage of tests have been run, that's test completion. And 100% tested is not, 100% coverage is not 100% tested. It's only in one dimension of many possible dimensions. So beware of the coverage traps that I talked about. And remember, whenever you hear the word coverage, ask, of what? Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dorothy, for that presentation. I'm just going to open my screen here again. As I mentioned at the start of this webinar, Dorothy is one of the program committee for our upcoming EuroSTAR conference taking place next month in London, and she'll be presenting as well a workshop entitled Test Automation Management Patterns. And right now we have an early bird discount to go to this conference where you can get a one-day ticket for $299 or a two-day ticket for $519. And you can find out all about that over on the EuroSTAR website. The link is there underneath. If you're thinking about going as a group, you can avail of our discount, our group discount, where you can get 4 tickets for the price of 3. And this is available right up to the conference and not February 3rd like the previous offer. Let me just jump back a slide here. This early bird offer is only available to February 3rd, but the group offer is available right up until the conference takes place. We also have our EuroSTAR conference, and the call for submissions deadline is right around the corner. Its deadline is the 5th of February, and if you would like to speak at this year's conference, then make sure you submit your presentation topic to EuroSTAR before the deadline on February 5th. And before we look at questions, just to let you know that we have some more webinars lined up for you next month. We have a webinar with Ard Kramer that looks at, is there a risk? And we have another webinar with Dirk-Jan de Groot, who will be looking at creating agile test strategies for larger enterprises. All right, so let's have a look and see what questions have come through here. And the first question I have here, Dorothy, says, as a tester, when we talk to end customer, how easy is it to ask what coverage?
I suppose that would probably depend on who your customer was and what relationship you had with them. I mean, if this is something that your customer is bringing up and saying we need to have coverage, then you might need to explain to them what coverage actually is and ask why it is that they think they need coverage. I mean, when people ask for coverage, they're normally asking for some sort of level of thoroughness, but they need to understand that thoroughness in one dimension means maybe not so thorough in another dimension, particularly with regard to the breadth and the depth. In terms of, I mean, if I wouldn't think coverage would necessarily be something that the tester would bring up in talking to the customer, but maybe it would be something which would give them an idea of how thorough the testing had been. It's a bit of a vague question, I'm afraid, and this is a bit of a vague answer.
Another question here, Dorothy asks, what if the map is poorly defined or non-existent? Have you any tips on getting it defined?
Sorry, what is poorly defined?
I'll read it out again here. And the question asks, what if the map is poorly defined or non-existent? Any tips on getting it defined?
Oh, right. So in terms of measuring the coverage, what if you can't see what it is that you could possibly cover? Well, I mean, in order to start sort of doing coverage, if you have nothing at all, anything that you can make a list of that you can then see whether some tests have gone through it, those can form a coverage criteria. So at a very high level, if you have, say, 5 major functions, you could just say, has a test gone through each of these 5 major functions, and just put them in a list, you know, in a table, in a spreadsheet, and see which tests go through it. if you can, I mean, there are many models of the system. Anytime that you have a model of your system, for example, a flowchart is a model of the way the code works. But if you have a diagram, for example, or a state chart or an entity diagram, any kind of diagram that represents what the system is, you can look at whether your tests have touched every element that's on that diagram, every line or every box or that sort of thing. So that might be a way to sort of get started to think about how to measure coverage.
Another question here asks, why should we, as testers, care about coverage? What are the benefits for us?
Well, that's a good question. Coverage is a way of, an objective way of measuring thoroughness in some aspect. And if you're testing, if you want testing to be thorough, then coverage will tell you whether it has been or not. But even if you don't care about how thorough your testing is, but you want to know what's been tested and what hasn't been tested, then if you know what the coverage is, that will tell you what you haven't tested. So the benefits for testers is to see, because when you're writing the tests, you're writing the tests for the system, and if you want to sort of test the system well, you want to have some way of saying, well, have I tested all the right things? Have I tested to the right level? And that kind of thing. And coverage can help to answer the question as to whether you've tested to the right level, if you can measure coverage. So it's a way of telling you a bit about how thorough your testing has been. I think that's the main benefit for testers.
Can coverage help to show the quality of testing?
Well, coverage is showing where the tests have been, but it doesn't actually say anything about whether a test is a good test or not. Because you might have a test that doesn't really do a lot. In terms of automated tests, we have this concept of zombie tests, which we talk about in the patterns. And this is a test which opens up the system, doesn't do anything, turns green, and then stops. It does absolutely nothing. Now, if that test was exercising some part of the system, even though it's not sort of telling whether the system is producing the right values or anything, you might well get the coverage box ticked, even though the test wasn't a very good test. So coverage doesn't really tell you about the quality of the testing. It just tells you about whether the tests have exercised some part of the system. That's one of the drawbacks of coverage.
All right, there's another question here, Dorothy. It's slightly longer, so if you need me to repeat it, I will. And this person here asks, or basically says, we follow a practice to maintain requirements traceability matrix to record what requirements test coverage we have. How do I know what we've missed? We covered everything on backlog, and that's what we planned to build.
Okay, well, if you have a requirements traceability matrix, then that is something that you can use as your coverage items. So if you have tested every requirement that's in that matrix, then you have 100% coverage of those requirements. Now, depending on how detailed those requirements are, you may have just one test for a given requirement, but it might be a bit more complex than that. But it will at least let you know if there was a requirement that didn't get tested at all. And then you said you've something about the backlog. Could you repeat that part of it?
I'm sorry, Dorothy. After clearing that off my questions slides here, apologies. I'll send it on to you afterwards there, or if our attendee is still here, if you'd like to rephrase your question again there, we can have a look at it for you. And if anyone else has any questions, please type them there now, and we'll go through them. Someone else here, Dorothy, asks, is there a book on coverage you could recommend?
I don't know about a book exclusively on coverage, but many books about testing technique. Any book about testing techniques, if it covers white box techniques, will talk about coverage. The ISTQB Foundation book that I've co-authored with Rex Black and Eric Veenendahl, we have a section in there about coverage. And so does any other book that supports the ISTQB Foundation level or indeed the advanced levels.
All right, if there's any other questions, please type them now. I don't see any at the moment. One of our attendees here, Robin Goldsmith, has shared an interesting article here. I'll share it with you all, and it might help you along with your testing. And a few people have asked as well if this webinar is being recorded, and the answer is yes, this webinar is recorded, as are all of our webinars, and you will find them all on the Test Huddle website very shortly. I don't think there's any other questions coming in here, so let me just have another quick look. There's one other
Okay, can
question
I
here.
just say,
Yes.
I'll just say hi to Robin, and thanks very much for passing on an article. Thank you. Hope to see you again soon.
Yes, thank you, Robin. And Robin's provided lots of great materials for us over on Huddle, so we appreciate it. Another question here, Dorothy says, do you think that assigning coverage as a white box technique is a mistake?
Saying that coverage is a white box technique? I mean, as I understand it, a black box technique is one where you don't look inside the box. You don't care how it actually achieves anything. So you're actually looking at the code purely from the outside, what goes in and what should come out. Whereas with a white box, you're actually opening up the box, or sometimes people call it glass box. So you do care what's happening inside, and you do care about how the tests are going through the code. So I think coverage is very definitely a white box technique because it's concerned with the structure of the code, as is static analysis. That's also a white box technique. Whereas the black box techniques like equivalence partitioning or some of the boundary value analysis, they aren't concerned with how the software solves a problem. And there could be different ways for the code to be written to solve a given problem. But a black box technique just wants to make sure that it's producing the correct answer, whereas a white box is looking at how it's actually got to where it's got. So I think white box is right for coverage.
Okay, great, Dorothy. I think we'll wrap it up there at that. There's a few more people here just complimenting here. They enjoyed the presentation. One person here says, many thanks for an excellent presentation and refresher on testing coverage. And thank you for coming along to that attendee. And thank you to all of our attendees for coming along. And a special thank you to Dorothy for taking time out to present this webinar. And we look forward to catching up with her next month over in London at EuroSTAR. And perhaps, Dorothy, maybe you might be able to tell our attendees here a little bit about your upcoming talk and what they could expect from it.
Yes, and I'd like to say thank you very much, by the way. Thank you to everyone who's attended the webinar, and thank you for the very nice comments. Yes, the presentation at EuroSTAR I'm doing with Saretta Gamba, and we're talking about test automation patterns. We have a wiki, which is called testautomationpatterns.org or testautomationpatterns.wikispaces.com, and we'll be talking about some of the management level issues and patterns. They're not the same as code patterns, which are more prescriptive, but these patterns are more almost like behavior patterns, but they are common things that happen to people when they're doing test automation, and we'll be discussing the problems and also the solutions which have worked well for other people. That's basically what a pattern is something which a number of people have found works well. So we'll be taking people through the wiki, showing them how that works. We've got a couple of exercises and so on, and we'll be talking about test automation patterns, mainly management ones, but any that people have any questions on.
Sounds great, Dorothy. Looking forward to it. So let's wrap it up there, and thank you all, everybody, once again for coming to this webinar, and we hope to see you at future webinars, and you can sign up for all these webinars over on the Huddle website. So thank you all, and take care.
Thanks and goodbye.